Hi, everybody. Thursday night at about 9 p.m. This is Joe Firestone live. The guest, once again, is Richard Dien Winfield, returning. Okay, and Richard is a candidate for Congress in Georgia's 10th district, running in Democratic primary. And he has a very broad platform, and it's one which is dedicated to economic and social justice. Okay, and the first installment, which was last Thursday, we went through have 2/3 of the platform, and he had some revolutionary things to say. And in this installment, we're going to complete the platform. So I'm going to show us both now our names, and we will start our discussion. And I think we left off last week. It was on the immigration issue, Richard, right?
Perhaps. I've sort of forgotten where we ended, but we can begin there.
Okay, let's do so then.
I mean, I think if we want to consider what's regarded as an immigration problem, we want to think about what has led to the current situation where we have 11.2 million undocumented. And I think there are several facets of the story that we as a nation are responsible for. One is the war on drugs, which has, in a sense, tremendously enriched and empowered the drug cartels by allowing this gigantic business of personal drug consumption in the United States to be illegal and thereby to be in the hands of criminal organizations. And that has then led to this epidemic of violence in many parts of Latin America. And that has led to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people fleeing for their lives to what they would consider a safer haven and a place where they might be able to earn a better living, the United States. So I think that's one part of it. And I say that with a little personal experience because my wife is now an immigration lawyer, and she has quite a few clients who have very grisly stories to say about the kind of violence they and their families have been subject to through just the explosion of criminality and guns in Central America in particular, certain countries. That's one side. The other side, I think, are the trade policies that we followed, which by opting for a kind of free trade in the NAFTA region has led to certain parts of the indigenous agriculture being decimated because they can't survive in face of the influx of American highly productive agricultural exports. So we have large parts of the peasantry who've become pauperized and once again have fled northward to be able to survive. So I think these are two things that are important in generating the huge influx of people from that border. And the other part of it is that, we have not enforced our immigration laws. We obviously, it may not be that easy, but we haven't. And part of it is not simply a matter of securing our borders. I think many more people have gained a kind of illegal status because they've come in legally, but they've overstayed. I think that's true of 85% of the people who are legal. They've overstayed the visas they had legally. And by not enforcing our immigration laws, there's this huge labor force that's living in the shadows. It's insecure and afraid, and employers have taken advantage of them. They've substituted these people for the people who had been doing that work because they can pay them less. Sometimes they can avoid paying them entirely because they can push them around much more easily. And I think that's another side of it. So I think if we're, and the other side of it, of course, is just the general kind of economic insecurity of large parts of our own population, which has stoked a hatred of immigrants as well as other minorities, and that people like Trump and other demagogues have taken advantage of. So I think if you want an overall solution, which would allow for there to be a comprehensive immigration reform, we have to first get rid of the drug war. I wouldn't say first, but we have to get rid of the drug war, legalize all personal use of drugs, provide them to people who are dependent upon them, offer them with a kind of single-payer healthcare, all of the counseling and mental and physical healthcare they need to deal with their consumption of drugs. That way we shut down the cartels and, well, diminish to a great degree the kind of violence and lawlessness that has led many people in Latin America to flee for their lives. On the other hand, we can think of different kinds of trade policies that are not going to destroy whole sectors of Latin American indigenous activity. And on the other hand, we can provide legal status to all of these people who we have allowed to be here and to some degree be taken advantage of. And at the same time, provide economic security to everyone else so that no one is going to be suffering from a return to legality.
So you are relating our fiscal policy, our drug policy, immigration policy, law enforcement policies all together, and our treatment.
Yeah.
And you're saying this all has to be handled as a panel.
Yes.
We're not going to solve the problem.
Yeah. And I think it's doable. I mean, the other side of it is our whole immigration bureaucracy is greatly understaffed, not so much in terms of the people patrolling the border, but in terms of judges and other people who can process all of the cases that come up. You know, there are huge backlogs, both in terms of handling visa applications and the like, but also dealing with refugees who end up in our country, people who've come in illegally, dealing with their predicament. I mean, I don't see any reason to incarcerate illegal aliens before they end up getting deported. I mean, we have means to be able to track them.
Before we continue, I'd like to say to the audience, because we're making a lot of comments that echoes and home. We've been experimenting with action since before the broadcast started.
Yeah.
And Richard has turned down his sound now to something like 40%. And I have turned down mine considerably also in vain efforts to eliminate the echo. Okay, now I'm no longer hearing the echo.
I turned down my sound a bit further, so maybe that did the trick.
Okay, let's see. Is my sound all right, everybody, right now? Okay, Mark says we're getting it. Okay, Tricia says we're getting it also.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go further then.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry to have interrupted you. Let's go ahead now.
Now, you know, there are many, many facts. In fact, I see them in some of the comments coming on the screen of people who want to claim that, you know, the illegal immigrants are committing crimes of all sorts. But, you know, I think it's been documented that they actually have a lower crime rate than our actual citizenry.
Yes, I agree. It has been documented, okay, that their crime rate is lower. And as far as the illegality of their being here is concerned, we as a society have been very complicit in that all along, especially the business community that has wanted to exploit them and that has resisted uh, clamping down on immigration themselves. If they were not actually offering jobs to immigrants, then the immigrants would not have come in the first place. If we had not been involved in a trade treaty with Mexico that was absolutely exploiting Mexico and driving the farmers there entirely out of business, then also the migrants would not be here. So there is plenty of blame in this to go around, and to place all the blame on the migrants themselves is just scapegoating. It's old-fashioned scapegoating because but these people are culturally different from ourselves, okay, and because their skin coloring is a little different.
The other part of it is our failure to really commit the resources to enforce labor laws.
Yes.
And also to ensure a fair minimum wage.
That's right. And to create here in the United States a situation where we've had a stagnant economy for some time that has been incapable, okay, of employing everyone. So that when the immigrants came over, they were part of a situation where they could perform the function of working for less, so as to satisfy the needs of business for profits, okay, at all costs.
I mean, one of the reasons why in certain agricultural areas you could say that there's a shortage of labor requiring, let's say, the bringing in of seasonal workers. I mean, to some degree, that has to do with how little they're paying people.
I think to a great extent, they were unwilling, the farmers, to pay a fair wage that would have led them to be able to employ people who are already here. And that was true from the beginning. They were looking for cheap labor, and they would not offer jobs at a fair wage for what is back-breaking work in the fields. So that's been something wrong from the beginning of this. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
It's a huge welfare problem for the families of the migrant workers who come here. It's not just that the migrant workers are being underpaid and their proper work conditions are not being properly regulated and enforced, but their families are left up in the air. You know, proper schooling is not provided, proper health care, of course, is not provided, proper housing is not provided. You know, all of these things are not properly scrutinized as they should be. But so, you know, I think, the pillar of our immigration policy has been that on the one hand, we're going to respect family reunification, contrary to the complaints of the, Republicans who are inveighing against what they're calling chain immigration. We want to support family reunification. We do want to get people who have various kinds of skills of all sorts that our economy needs. We also want to take our fair share of refugees and humanitarian cases. All of this should be built into a comprehensive immigration reform. And to some degree, we may have to increase, or we perhaps should increase many of the quotas we have. Because there are people who are waiting for decades to get family members to arrive. And the whole system is very much understaffed. There are huge backlogs. So instead of putting resources into a wall, we need to, provide more immigration employees to handle the cases, and we could use a Marshall Plan for Latin America instead of spending $25 billion on a wall that will not work. I spoke to one expert on immigration who pointed out that, there's no shortage of all sorts of high-tech devices. And there was a whole system installed by IBM to be able to sense anyone coming across the border. But the problem is all of these high-tech devices, they end up getting defeated by in some respect, the weather, the nature, the desert, the sand, and they're not effective. I don't think these are really what will do the trick. We have to think about, why are people coming here? What is causing them to leave their homes? I mean, no one wants to do that if they can avoid it. So I think we have to think of the big picture. And if we don't address that with the resources it needs, the emphasis on securing borders and enforcement is not going to be able to be successful. I mean, remember, again, the overwhelming majority of people who are here illegally did not come illegally across the border. They came legally and they've stayed on. So we have to think about dealing with that.
Okay.
And of course, I know from my wife's experience as an immigration lawyer, I've sometimes driven her down to one of these for-profit prisons that they have here in southern Georgia, where they lock up people who are subject to deportation. And it's a for-profit prison that does its minimum, provides minimum services to the inmates. It's a non-union workplace as well. It's as far away as possible from where the families of the inmates are. There's actually no cell phone service there. You get to it on roads that are falling apart. Everything is being done in a way to, you could say, to just treat the families involved as inhumanely as possible.
Yes.
And there's no reason to lock these people up. We have means of tracking people. They don't have to be separated from their families, and there are a fair number of suicides in this facility. People are there for long, long periods of time, and they're, it's a big facility. A lot of people are packed together. You can be sure that the for-profit prison is not making things comfortable for anyone inside it.
Okay, thank you for a very wonderful summary of the immigration situation and all the facets of it, okay, and an indication of how complex it is, and how we need to have not simple policies, but essentially multifaceted policies that have to be designed to handle the complexity of the problem. And that's in substantial contrast to the simple policy, okay, of Donald Trump, which is, build a wall, and that's going to take care of it. A simple-minded policy that's fit for a 5 or 6 year old, okay, and not fit for the president of the United States. So anyway, let's leave immigration reform per se, but not entirely, because the next plank in your platform is to guarantee affordable housing for all.
Yeah.
So could you speak to us on that, please?
Now, that is also a multifaceted problem.
Yes, it is.
Because on the one hand, one measure I speak of, which is made possible by a federal job guarantee and fair wages and a degree of employee empowerment. That's the idea that we can lift the fear of having utility cutoffs, of being evicted or being foreclosed. That one, many people, after all, 70% of Americans have no more than $700 in reserve to meet any difficulty. So if you face difficulty, and of course, healthcare is the biggest source of bankruptcies in this country, you find yourself not able to pay your utility bills. Well, how can you live without heat, water, electricity, not to mention broadband? And then to face eviction because you can't pay rent, or foreclosure because you can't pay a mortgage. Now, I think this is a source, obviously, of homelessness, or people doubling up with relatives. We can stop this. We can have a complete moratorium on utility cutoffs, on evictions, on foreclosures, by having mandatory rescheduling of payments.
Yes.
And that's possible if everyone has a stream of income. And that is possible if we have full employment with the federal job guarantee and equivalent replacement income for those people who are truly unable to work. And so it's something that can be dealt with without causing landlords or banks to go bankrupt. We can give them a reasonable type of rescheduling, and we don't have to put people through the trauma of becoming homeless or facing the threat of homelessness. Now, on the other hand, we also have to think about how we supply affordable housing. And so even if we were to provide everyone with income and jobs and so forth, there are obviously plenty of urban centers in America where a vast part of the public is simply incapable of affording housing, at least in large parts of these cities. Now, there are various options that can be followed. Of course, you can have public housing that is built, and a jobs program can involve building affordable housing. You don't want to ghettoize people in terms of mean tests. So I think if you want to have government housing, it should be such that it's not geographically isolated from the housing of other parts of the population. It could be interspersed. It could have different kind of rent levels or mortgage payment levels. I lived for 3 years before coming down to Georgia in a rent-stabilized apartment on West 16th Street in Manhattan.
Yes.
I paid about $280 of rent back then. Now, that was a long time ago, but it wasn't considered expensive back then.
Yes.
It was reasonable. And what corrupted that whole system in New York City is that landlords were, in a way, permitted to transform rental properties into condominiums and cooperatives.
Yes.
Now, the law at that time, and I benefited from it because I got a job in Georgia and I was able to come down here. But the law then prevented landlords from evicting anyone who didn't want to buy a condominium. But to allow them to transform rent-stabilized units into condominiums, they had to get a vote from the people living in these rental units. A majority had to favor the idea, and the way they got that was by offering the people living in these rental units the ability to buy the apartment at a price far below the market value. And you could even sell your insider purchase rights to someone else. I did that because I was moving out of Manhattan to Georgia.
I see.
If you're going to remain in New York City, it's not going to help you to sell because you have to buy something that will be just as expensive. But for me, it was a windfall. I could pay most of the mortgage on the house that I ended up buying a couple of years after I got there. But I think we want to think about things like rent stabilization and rent control, where landlords are limited with regard to how much they can raise rents. Now, obviously, you don't want to make it impossible for landlords to be able to afford to maintain buildings. My wife is from India, and if you go to India, in many cities there are extremely severe laws that to some degree favor the tenants, in that it's very hard to evict anyone. And rents in many cities are extremely low. But what that has meant is that landlords simply don't maintain the buildings. And that's even true of buildings that are housing people that are well-to-do. The inside of the apartments are in decent shape, but the moment you step out the door onto the landing or the staircases, it's completely decrepit, and the outside of the building is decrepit. The sidewalks are decrepit, etc. So we have to think about ways to navigate, these extremes, and if we're going to make use of controls on rent levels and the like, we have to do it in a way that's going to allow the buildings to be maintained, if they're going to be privately held, either as rentals or even as mortgages. Another option, which you have in Athens, there's something called the Athens Land Trust. It buys land and then it builds low-cost single-family houses that are pretty nice. They're not that huge, but they sell them at a fairly reduced rate to people who don't own the land. The land is owned by the land trust. So these people, if they want to leave, they have to sell the house back to the land trust, and they're guaranteed getting back pretty much what they paid for it. So it allows them to become homeowners in a way that extends it without putting them under these predatory mortgages and the like. So I think there are various options that would have to be taken. But I think we need to guarantee affordable housing to everyone. And we have to ensure there aren't any homeless people. And that does involve more than simply giving people jobs and income, because there are plenty of homeless people who do have jobs, but they don't have enough income to either rent an apartment or buy a house.
Yes, especially when they have a job at $8 an hour or $9 an hour or something like that, and they live in a major city. That's just not going to work.
Yeah.
So,
but it's even possible when you're working more than that. My daughter works in Washington, and although she's not making a huge amount, she's making a lot more than $8 an hour. But she can barely afford an apartment. So
yes, I'm sure that's true, because that was true for my daughter.
Yeah.
Until she moved out to California roughly 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and then she moved to Los Angeles, but she had a better job out there, okay, and a higher income. Okay, so
I mean, another option, of course. I mean, another thing to think about is the kind of gentrification taking place in many neighborhoods in urban areas.
Yes.
You see it here in Athens, which is the poorest city of its size in America, despite having a very large flagship university and many students who come from relatively affluent and ever more affluent backgrounds as the qualifications to get up, in a sense, to get in rise. But you know, the lack of city planning or controls on zoning allows these builders to put in quite expensive high-rise apartments that the average families cannot possibly afford. So another option is to require any new development to have a certain number of low-cost units or medium-cost units in them. And not isolated physically, but within the same units.
Yes.
Unfortunately, Georgia's state law prevents any municipality from doing something like that. So I think we have to think of some national initiatives to make that possible.
I agree. Okay, so the next item is you're guaranteeing quality education at all levels. So how would that happen?
Well, first of all, I think we all know that public education is not equal. You know, despite the fact that in the South, for example, you had a separate but unequal education system overturned through integration. The integrated schools are not equal, and the treatment of students is not equal. First of all, of course, there's been tremendous white flight or flight of parents moving children from schools to not have them have to mingle with poor people, who admittedly are suffering all sorts of problems, and you know, they have their rough edges and their problems in getting through school. So you can understand to some degree why parents might want to do that, besides rank racism or whatever. But you have these two systems. You have these systems of private schools and then public schools. And the public schools, other than in the suburbs, have predominantly poor people in them. That's true in the Athens public schools here.
Yes.
And then if you look at the resources, since the financial support for these schools is derived largely from real estate taxes, you know, those communities that have less valuable real estate have less money to spend on public education for schools. Now, there are measures in states to some degree spread the taxational law around, but not to make it completely equal. And I think one has to think about that. One wants to ensure that the funding per child is fairly equivalent. But I also think that within schools, we want to make sure that the people who are struggling get the most resources. I mean, I know in the public schools here, what is a common practice? You have the so-called programs for the gifted.
Yes.
Kids are almost entirely from the more affluent, more highly educated households. And then you have advanced placement courses, and you have a kind of tracking system, again, where a lot of resources are given to the students who are, you know, who are getting by more successfully in school. And who are they? They are uniformly coming from the more affluent, more highly educated families. And then you have large numbers of people, particularly minorities in many cities, who are not learning to read and write. And if they don't learn to read and write properly by, let's say, the third grade, then all their other schooling goes down the drain. They can't possibly succeed. They're going to feel despairing and not be able to function. So we have to think about really not only removing the background poverty that is weighing upon the lives of everyone in schools and making it difficult for schools themselves to succeed, no matter what they do. But then too, one has to think about using the resources properly. To give you an example of what I think is a kind of pernicious policy in the public schools in Athens, this was after my 3 children went through them, so I didn't experience it directly. But after that, they got rid of textbooks and gave students laptops.
Oh.
Now, of course, in Athens, like many other cities, if you come from a family that's not well off, not only are you less likely to have a computer at home, you're less likely to have any Wi-Fi at home or broadband at home. So I was at one of these monthly democratic breakfasts that used to take place in Athens, and they had the head of the school superintendent, and I asked him about this. I mean, doesn't this work against poorer kids because they don't have the same kind of broadband at home? And he said, well, they've designed it so that it will work offline. But even if that's the case, the kids who can work online obviously have an advantage. And if you don't have any school books, the kids who are in families that don't have libraries in their homes just don't have access to reading materials and other cultural activities. And now what's happened in the schools in Athens, apparently, is they no longer allow students to take the laptops home. Perhaps because they were getting broken or who knows what. But they don't have textbooks. So what do they have at home to educate themselves with? Nothing.
They have nothing at home.
So I think these are the kind of things we have to think about. We have to ensure that not only do we have this resources for everyone, but we have to ensure that all the so-called enrichment things that more affluent kids enjoy because their parents hire music teachers or take them around to all sorts of classes of various sorts after school. We have to ensure that these are offered to students in school. I mean, in school, there should not only be, I think, a daily gym class for every kid at every grade level, there should be daily music and art classes. And I think in high school, there should be philosophy offered, at least 2 years of philosophy. And after all, schooling is not just a matter of learning a vocation, it's about becoming a seeker of truth and justice and to be thoughtful about these things. And if this is going to be done properly, I think we have to really rethink how we train teachers, because you have this, what I think is a debasement of teacher training in schools of education here, where we treat teaching as if there were some formal skill of being a teacher. So you study education, whereas instead you should be studying the subject matter that you're going to be teaching and become an expert in it. I mean, I'm a university professor. I never had any courses on how to teach, right? I just had to supposedly gain mastery in my subject matter. Well, I think we have to require all new teachers to have MAs in their subject area. And if they're going to have heads of departments, they should have PhDs. And I think we need to pay them accordingly. We have to raise teacher salaries, obviously. So I think we have to increase the salary, qualifications, numbers of teachers, reduce class size, equalize the amount of resources given to students, and enrich the curriculum. And I think if we do this and at the same time eliminate poverty and provide people with proper health care, because a lot of poor kids don't have proper health care, let alone nutrition. How can they function academically? So all of these are parts of the puzzle. And then we come to higher education, which obviously is not just about college. I mean, a minority of Americans go to college. We who went to college are an elite, even though the US at one time had the greatest proportion of people going to college, but it never was a majority. That is in terms of people finishing college. But then, of course, we also need technical training beyond high school. All of these things should be made available to people irrespective of whatever financial resources they have. So we should have, in a sense, free tuition for all of these kind of higher education. But that's not enough. My father, for example, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, he grew up in New York City. His family were poor immigrants. They never got out of poverty, really. He had to work all the time. But he did go to school. He performed well. He got admitted to City College. My mother got admitted to Hunter College in similar circumstances, but she was able to go, but he couldn't. He couldn't afford to go. He had to work all the time. So it's not enough to have free tuition. You also have to give living stipends to students so they can afford to go to school. They do that in Europe. They don't just give higher education with free tuition. They also give them living stipends, and we have to think of that.
Yeah, yes, they do. And they, in some of the countries in Europe, they pay teachers the kinds of salaries that doctors and engineers get here.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a student in Heidelberg in philosophy, I did an MA at the University of Heidelberg. I mean, the job prospects for a philosophy graduate, someone getting a PhD in Germany, in universities were very poor. There were very few positions available. But that wasn't what most people expected. They expected to teach in a gymnasium, that is in a sort of college-bound secondary school. And there they were treated with a lot of respect. Of course, the curriculum in the gymnasium was at the level of an American undergraduate college. And they were paid well. Well, we could do something like that, after all.
We could indeed.
Yep.
Yeah, we could indeed. Okay.
And note that they're the teachers in the secondary schools in Germany, in a place like that, or in the lycée in France. They're not studying education. They're gaining mastery at the highest level of their area that they're going to be teaching. And that's what we should be doing. And that, by the way, would solve the job problem for PhDs, because they could teach in our high schools and improve the level of our high schools, earn a decent living. And look, high school kids are not that different from undergraduates, right? It's not as if you're demeaning yourself by having to teach them. So,
yes, they can be very, very smart. Yeah, no question about that. Okay, so the next plank on your program is doing something about the internet and by guaranteeing affordable internet access.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think today it's obvious that it's very hard to enjoy one's various freedoms if you do not have access to the internet. You know, you can't get healthcare unless you can go online. You can't get a job, apply for a job in many cases unless you can go online. You don't have access to the news. I mean, in many areas, they're no longer print media, etc. So if we really want to have equal opportunity, we have to consider this as a basic utility, like water, like heat, like electricity. Everyone should have broadband access. And that means two things. They have to have the device that is up to date and lets them access it. And they have to have the connectivity. And obviously, poor people don't have those resources. And in many places, particularly in my District 10, which is largely rural and small town, it's really impossible to get broadband access in many of the rural areas. It's simply not available. You know, you can get your old-fashioned call-up DSL, but not real broadband. So, you know, just as in the days of the TVA, when the concern was electrification, now we can put people to work providing universal broadband everywhere. And then in addition, we want to think about net neutrality. Because if we don't have net neutrality, you know, the monopolies of providers will be used to not only jack up prices, but to interfere with the free dissemination of both different kinds of applications and information, etc. So I think it's a matter both of intellectual freedom and equal opportunity that we ensure we have net neutrality on top of that.
Yes, I agree, but we have to make the internet also affordable. And right now it's becoming increasingly unaffordable.
Yeah, yeah.
When I lived in Alexandria 2 years ago,
yeah,
you know, the charges had been jacked up to $188 a month.
Yeah.
When I moved out here to Ashburn,
wow,
which is basically 40 miles away or something like that.
Yeah.
I found those same charges, okay, were at $110. But since then, in just a couple of years, okay, I now am paying $128 a month, but for the same service. Each year, they jack up the cost of the internet by roughly 14 to 15%.
Yeah.
Okay? And they're allowed to do that because the competitive situation, okay, is limited. Either the provider is the sole company, or the provider is one of two companies in a particular area that are providing service. And so there is no free market. It's just a dictated market by the ISP. And so we have to end that, okay, because there can't be affordable internet as long as we have that kind of situation.
I mean, think of the approach that our country used to have with regard to utilities. I mean, we can remember when Ma Bell had this absolute monopoly on telecommunications, pretty much, but it was highly regulated.
Yes.
So they got
I do remember that very well.
Their stock to get those sure dividends, and yet the rates were not extreme, right?
Yes.
We could do that with broadband, or we can make it a public utility, right? Either way. That doesn't mean that it's inefficient. It can be more efficient as long as it's as long as it's accountable and sufficient investment is made. But I think the goal is we want to, however we implement it, we want to ensure that everyone has access to it. And again, I think our general approach to any of the resources we need to exercise our freedoms is we should not have means tests for any of it. We should not be subsidizing people because of their income. We instead should offer it to everyone.
Yes.
And then we can pay for it through, well, of course, there's controversy about whether we need taxes to pay for it or whatever. But let's say if we use taxes, or at least use the appearance that taxes have anything to do with it, we want to have a progressive and fair tax system.
Yes, of course. Okay, so now we come to the last thing that we have not actually talked about in some detail. And that's perhaps the biggest problem of all. And that's the environment and climate change.
Yeah.
So how would you address that?
Well, I think one thing we can use to address climate change is the federal job guarantee. That is, there are two sides to how we implement full employment. One is we obviously have to see what are the skills of the various people who need work and what can they do. The other is to see what does our community need to have done? What are the goods and services? Well, obviously we have to deal with climate change, I should say. And we need to really put a lid on the kind of energy production that is, inciting global warming. And I would say prevent any expansion whatsoever of fossil fuel generation, and instead move as quickly as we can to substitute clean energy for it. And we can put people to work doing that. And I think we can do it directly in terms of government employment, which can also involve manufacturing the kind of devices we need, be they solar panels or whatever else. So I think we need public investment in this. We also need to regulate the energy producers in such a way that we're not subsidizing the further development of fossil fuel production. But rather, if we're going to favor anything, it should be the opposite. So I think we really want to think about creating a green infrastructure as soon as possible and make that obviously a national priority. And obviously,
it seems to me we do a lot more. We have to do a lot more than simply think about it.
Yeah.
There doesn't appear to be any time left.
And it's an international problem. I go to India frequently because my wife is from India. And to some degree, our marital arrangement involved a commitment to return to India every summer. And so I've seen over 35 years India in certain respects booming with growing industrial development, but also there's a tremendous environmental cost. And obviously there's great pressure in India and China to increase energy production so that the standard of living can increase, which in some respect it needs to. But, we have to help them increase their energy production by making it green, as opposed to being coal and other fossil fuels. And, we're obviously helping ourselves as well as the rest of the world if we
Yes.
give them the support they need to increase their energy production in a clean manner. And I think that should be part of any kind of, it is to some degree part of the accords on climate change, which Trump withdrew us from. But, we need to accelerate all of that. Obviously we don't have that much time left to reverse
No,
things.
we don't have that much time left at all to reverse this.
And we really
have really frittered away our time, okay, because we've been able to see this crisis coming since at least the middle 1960s.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and the only serious attempt as yet to do anything about it was in the Carter administration. Okay, it was the best thing Carter did, I believe. And then that work was basically wasted, okay, and thrown out in the succeeding administrations by both the Republican Party administrations and the Democratic Party administrations. It's simply ignored the problem and swept it under the rug. And here we are at the end of the time we had to seriously adapt to this problem, and now our backs are against the wall.
And I think we have to, regulate our utilities so they move in this direction. In Georgia and many other places, the utility companies really don't want to let people develop their own, for example, solar power energy that would allow them to be self-sufficient and not have to.
Yes, I know, and they're influencing the local and state political systems.
Yeah.
To block people from doing this. And so we need some legislation at the national level to prevent that kind of activity.
Yeah.
But that will be very hard to get through Congress. And the only way to really get through Congress is to impress the whole Congress with the urgency of doing something now. So the question is, how will you be able to do that if you do go to Washington?
Well, I think it's becoming more and more clear to more and more of the public, not only that climate change is real, but that it's becoming more and more threatening, and that we do need to do things. We really need to think about how we rebuild after every next catastrophe. We don't want to simply maintain development in areas that are going to be threatened more and more. We want to think about how we're going to be sort of, redeveloping areas so that they will be safe.
Right. Okay. So are you in touch with other congressional candidates whose views are similar to your own?
There are very few that I've come upon. I've heard mainly through messages I get from them. Tim Canova recently speaking about something like guaranteed jobs, a federal job guarantee.
Yes.
There is a candidate in Georgia who's just announced, who I'm going to be getting in touch with. And his name is Francis Johnson. And I think that he wants to advocate a very strong anti-poverty program that will involve guaranteed jobs. So I definitely want to be in touch with him and see what we can do. I'm hopeful that elsewhere in the country there'll be people who will take up that particular policy as well as many of these other policies that I'm advocating.
Okay, it seems to me if such people could come together even before the primary campaigns, okay, and could carry the coalition through the primaries into the general election. And a substantial number of them could win office, and they could enter Congress that way forming a caucus in Congress that insisted on certain things from the establishment that they would be able to move the political system towards them.
I mean, I would hope that some national figures like Bernie Sanders would consider this kind of policy, which, to my knowledge, he hasn't yet considered. And
well, Bernie Sanders is focused, I think, on further developing the mass movement that he's trying to get going but right now, and I think he's also focused on doing a sufficient amount so that he retains some voice inside of the establishment at the same time. So he's playing a political game which involves really walking a very fine line. He obviously is continuously critical of the establishment, but at the same time he has to be with them in certain key ways. And he has to not say certain things that he could say, okay, or at least he feels that he has to not say certain things he could say. He seems to want to run as a Democrat, okay, in 2020. He certainly would like to have the Congress turn in 2018, but he seems to be primarily focused on building the movement rather than getting himself completely involved in electoral politics, okay, in 2018. So to some degree, the progressive candidates who would be able to join with him nationally have to, as you've done, get into the political fight on their own with their own resources, okay, and then essentially build a bloc that could join him.
I mean, I agree that it's
2020.
The candidates to set the agenda, because the Democratic Party itself, from my experience, does not really engage in much debate concerning what it stands for. And the party, particularly in a state like Georgia, has very little in the way of a carrot or a stick to wield to candidates to really influence them one way or the other. I mean, they don't give us very much support, particularly in districts that seem challenging with, Republican majorities. So really, we're on our own. But that means we are to define the agenda.
Yes, right. And that's both a curse and a blessing. But you're on your own, but you don't have to compromise with them because they're not really giving you anything anyway.
Yeah, precisely.
And if there are candidates like yourself who win, then you're not beholden to them at all.
No.
And then they have to come seek your support, and then you can exact a price at that point, if they need that support. And if they're not going to pay any price, then you don't have to support them.
I mean, look, a lot of sectors of the population feel that the Democratic Party has taken them for granted. I think that's true of many African Americans. It's certainly true of workers in general. I think it's true also of many women. So
yes, and I think certainly seniors feel that way also. Seniors have long since gone over to the Republican Party, which is really very, very hard to understand, but that's what's happened. It seems like they could easily be lured back into the Democratic Party with a few platform changes, which the party, of course, is unwilling to make. Okay, anyway, I guess I want to emphasize as a point that it would really be critical to be able to form a coalition with others and to exchange experiences and also to try to get some intelligence on what kinds of policies are working in the different areas of the United States.
Yeah.
I think comparative experience, is very, very important here.
Yeah.
And it has to be an exchange of experience among people who are basically like-minded, so that it's it's more elements of strategy and tactics as opposed to basic goals that you're talking about.
Well, I would welcome any candidates who are listening to this program to definitely contact me, and I would like to speak to them about what they're doing and get their suggestions and see to what degree we can make a common front and influence the national agenda as well as the agenda of the Democratic Party.
Okay, I think I mentioned last time there is a group, Revolt Against Plutocracy, which has been approaching candidates and signing them to a contract for American renewal.
Yeah.
The acronym for which is CFAR. Okay, and your program is in many ways very much more progressive than the CFAR contract. So you would have no trouble in signing up to CFAR, and that would put you in with a group of other congressional candidates, across the country, which number something like 23 or 24 at this point, including Tim Canova. And the CFAR people can then serve as a conduit for communication among you. They are capable of setting up online meetings.
Yeah.
That would basically connect all the candidates who would like to join them. Okay, and the Real Progressives group that I represent is currently closely allied with the CFAR effort. They're basically the activism end, of our effort at this point, though there's no formal connection of the parties yet. So we would be in a position to support that, and we're supporting the CFAR efforts. And as I say, they could provide an environment in which you would be able to communicate with a lot of other candidates across the country who agreed on a basic kind of, what they call it, a populist platform. Of course, it's not a right populist platform. It's very definitely the kind of platform that grew out of the Sanders campaign, of 2016. Instead. But what they mean by populist is that all the measures they're supporting in the CFAR have polled a majority of the population at this point, so that all the elements of the contract, they can say, are supported by a majority of the people, the American people. And so I think that's an interesting effort. Yeah. And as I say, it provides a forum for communication.
No, I definitely like to look them up and be in touch. So.
Okay, so we've gone about...
that there's also this material side of things where, in a way, because we do not or can't expect to get much support from the Democratic Party, for example, statewide or nationally, not just in the primary, but after the primary. we face the problem of getting resources, contributions, and the like. So if some of these groups could help their members do that, it would make things more achievable, needless to say.
Yes, I think so. And I think the closer we get to the election, okay, in 2018, the more support would be coming from the movement groups, okay, of one kind or another, because there's such a strong anti-establishment, anti-corporate feeling out there. Okay, and from that point of view, I think that Trump is just keeping that feeling alive.
Yeah.
In other words, the feelings that were raised by the Sanders campaign are becoming even more intense because of the Trump administration, all the appointments he's made to the administration. The actions, of the appointees, and the actions of the Republican Party. So, but from the point of view of building a movement, that's all favorable. Yeah. And we are trying very hard to build it. So, we've gone over your platform now. Okay, and I'd like to ask you...
Did you mention legal care?
I think we mentioned legal care last time, but if you'd like to say a few words about it now, go ahead.
Okay. I just want to, in some respect, that bears mention at the end, because we've been talking about all the things that could be considered part of what fall within the social rights we need to have recognized and enforced, but we can't uphold any of our rights if we can't have access to the legal process, to defend them. And in proposing legal care for all, I'm proposing an equivalent to a single-payer healthcare system that would apply to the cost of legal representation for not just criminal, but also civil cases. Our Constitution gives us the guarantee of criminal representation. It doesn't do that necessarily in the most equal way with, legal aid lawyers who are underfunded and court-appointed lawyers who are not paid necessarily the best. But there's nothing to provide for civil legal representation, which we need to press for our rights against discrimination, against sexual orientation, against infractions by corporations on the job, and all the very important family matters and property disputes that affect our lives in fundamental ways. So I think this would put us equal before the law to a much greater degree than we are now.
Yes, I agree. And I also think that you are the only candidate, that I know of, who's advocating for that. So I think that that's original, on your part, and sets you off actually from everyone else. And I was very happy to hear it, a week ago when you talked about it at first. What I'd like to ask you to do now is to leave us with a summary, of your vision, which we've been discussing, in copious detail in these two programs. Okay, and then I'd like to sign off after that.
Okay. To wrap it up, I really think that we can look upon this, what I'm putting forward, as initiatives to really fulfill the whole project of the American enterprise, which set out, to build a community that is going to realize the freedoms of all its members. But, our Constitution focuses almost exclusively on our political rights and our civil legal rights, but it doesn't say anything about our household or social rights. And we have to ensure that we have those rights both respected and enforced so that we can have the kind of livelihood we need to have real equal social opportunity, equal opportunity in society, to really take care of our families, and to have the basis to really participate as equals in politics. And this very much involves fulfilling the call that Roosevelt made in his 1944 address to Congress. We need to ensure that we provide for the right to work, the right to decent housing, the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to culture, to all the sorts of things we truly need to really live in a free society and free state. And our Constitution has not provided those guarantees. The two political parties have so far not provided for them through legislation and executive administration. The time is now. We can do it. We have all the resources we need. It's a question of political will. And it's political of changing the direction of our national debate. So that's why I'm running. And people can go to my website, winfieldforcongress.com, and see what I'm laying out. They can, of course, also contribute. But I think that we need to be discussing the positive solutions. And there are positive solutions. And the federal job guarantee is a basic building block on which everything else can be constructed. And that's what I'd like to leave with the audience. And I hope they will check me out. And I hope other candidates will take up similar proposals.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay.
I don't know how the rest of the audience feels, but I feel like...
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for giving me a chance to
really done a terrific job, and you have a wonderful platform.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I only regret that you cannot seek a higher office at this point. Okay, I know you have to take it by steps.
Yeah.
But still, I think that would be a thing to think about sometime in the future. Okay, I know we have to take the first bite first, and that's this year at this time in this particular campaign. Okay, so I wish you luck, and I think a number of people here, okay, are going to be in support of you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to have the kind of extended political discussion that is so rare anywhere in the public space.
Yeah, we try to provide that here.
Yeah. Well,
okay, so thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'll end it now.
Okay, bye.
Bye.